Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. You know, we love to really dig into these topics, and today we're going to be diving into something we all experience but probably don't fully understand. Intuition. You know those gut feelings, those things that tell you to do things but you don't know why.
It is fascinating how often we dismiss intuition as unreliable
Mm.
or like illogical
Mm-hmm.
when research suggests that it's actually a lot more sophisticated than we think.
So for this deep dive, we're using Gerd Gigerenzer's book, Gut Feelings, The Intelligence of the Unconscious. And we are going to be exploring how intuition works, when we should trust it, and even the idea that less information is sometimes better for decision making.
Yeah.
Which I know,
Counterintuitive.
counterintuitive, right.
Yeah.
So Gender Moser defines these gut feelings as these quick judgments that appear in consciousness. We might not fully understand why we have them, but they're strong enough to act upon.
Yeah.
But intuition has a reputation problem, right?
So that's the-
Like some people just think it's unreliable, random, maybe a little mystical.
Yeah. And the book addresses that skepticism head on. So Gigerenzer argues that these gut feelings are based on what he calls rules of thumb or heuristics.
Okay.
And they're deeply connected to like our evolved brain capability.
Okay, so like measure twice, cut once is guiding our intuition.
Well, think of them more as mental shortcuts that help us make judgments quickly and efficiently.
Gotcha.
A good example of a simple rule of thumb or heuristic is the recognition heuristic, which basically says if you recognize one thing but not another, infer that the recognized item has the higher value on whatever criterion you're using.
Okay.
So if you've heard of one city but not the other, then you might assume that the one you've heard of is bigger.
I need an example. I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, so in the book, he talks about a study where he asked German and American students to guess which city had a larger population, San Diego or San Antonio.
Okay.
And what was really interesting was that the Germans, who were less familiar with American cities, were more likely to pick the right answer.
Wait, so the people who knew less about American geography were more accurate? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's right. And the idea is that they were using the recognition heuristic. They'd heard of San Diego. They hadn't heard of San Antonio, so they went with San Diego. They were more likely to get it right because they were using that simple heuristic.
So what you're saying is sometimes knowing less can actually be an advantage. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, it challenges that deeply ingrained belief that more information is always better. Sometimes a simple rule of thumb like recognition is going to be more effective than like a complex analysis.
Okay, so we've got this recognition heuristic. What other examples of these rules of thumb are out there?
Well, let's think about something like a baseball player catching a fly ball.
Okay.
It seems almost instinctual, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's actually a rule of thumb at play called the gaze heuristic.
Okay. I can picture the player like intensely watching that ball coming down, but there's got to be more to it than just like staring right.
Well, the rule itself is very straightforward. The player fixes their gaze on the ball starts running and adjusts their speed so that the angle of gaze remains constant.
So they're not like doing physics equations in their head.
Not complex calculations.
It's just like keep your eye on the prize and move until...
It's a shortcut.
Okay. And that actually works.
It does. And what's even more fascinating is that we can actually teach this heuristic to people. So pilots who are learning to avoid mid-air collisions, they're taught a similar principle. They're told to fixate on a point and react based on the movement of the other plane relative to that point.
Okay, so these rules of thumb, they can even be effective in really high-stakes situations like flying a plane. So our brains have really developed these shortcuts to help us deal with all these complex scenarios. But this kind of brings up another question. If less information can be more wrong, how much should we rely on our memory? Is forgetting actually a good thing?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. So the book dives into the concept of adaptive forgetting, and it turns out that our brains are actually pretty good at getting rid of information that's not useful.
Wait, are you saying that forgetting things is actually beneficial? I always thought a good memory was like something to strive for.
Well, think of it this way. Your brain is like a highly efficient filing system,
Okay.
and it makes sure that the most relevant stuff is easily accessible. And then it lets go of the things that you don't really need anymore.
So like how my computer's file menu only shows my most recent documents.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It's working on the assumption that what you've used recently, you're probably going to need again. And this goes even deeper. The book talks about what's called the less is more effect,
Okay.
which suggests that having less information or fewer choices can lead to better outcomes.
No, that's a concept I can get behind. I'm all about simplifying things.
Well, you're in good company.
Yeah.
So the book mentions this Nobel laureate, Harry Markowitz, And when it came to his own retirement investments, he didn't use his complex, prize-winning techniques.
Oh, really?
He used a simple heuristic: distribute money equally among a set of funds.
So this brilliant economist chose a simple approach. Why would he do that?
Because sometimes a simple heuristic can actually outperform more complex strategies, especially when you're dealing with unpredictable environments like the stock market.
You've given me a lot to think about. Maybe we should trust our gut a little more often. But hold on. Before we go all in on intuition, let's explore how our brains actually make these unconscious inferences and how our perceptions shape our reality. Are you ready for a mind-bending visual illusion?
I think our listeners are going to enjoy this one.
All right, lay it on me. Let's bend my mind with this visual illusion.
Okay, so let's talk about something called the blind spot in our vision. You've probably heard of this. It's the place in your retina where the optic nerve connects, and there are no photoreceptor cells.
Right, I vaguely remember that from like high school biology. But the thing is, I don't see a blind spot when I look around. Shouldn't there just be like a blank spot in my vision?
Right, and that's because your brain is incredibly clever.
Okay.
It fills in that missing information based on what it sees around the blind spot.
Okay.
So Gigerenzer includes a really interesting visual in the book Figure 3-1,
Okay.
and it shows this smiling face,
Mm-hmm.
and then off to the side there's a sad face.
Okay.
And if you close one eye and focus on the smiling face and move the book closer, the sad face disappears.
Whoa, you're right. It's like my brain just decided to make it white, like the background, and it's just gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of how your brain isn't just passively recording what's out there.
Yeah.
It's actively constructing your reality,
Yeah.
making these inferences and filling in these gaps without you even knowing it.
So are you saying that what we see isn't necessarily what's actually there? Our brain is just kind of making it up as we go?
Well, in a way, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's this constant unconscious betting system where our brains are always making these predictions and filling in the blanks.
That's kind of freaky, but also pretty amazing.
It's really elegant.
Yeah. So if our brains are making these unconscious inferences about what we see, do they do something similar when we're trying to figure out other people's intentions?
Yeah, you're getting into the realm of social intelligence.
Yeah.
And Gigerenzer talks about something called the mind-reading heuristic,
Okay.
which is our ability to infer what someone is thinking or feeling based on their gaze.
So like when I see my dog staring intently at the treat jar, I know he wants a treat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You see a child staring intently at a toy, you can pretty much guess they want that toy.
Right. So our brains have evolved to like pick up on these subtle cues and make these split-second judgments about what other people are thinking.
Exactly. And there's actually some evidence that this ability is localized to a specific part of the brain called the superior temporal sulcus.
Oh, wow.
And this heuristic seems to be impaired in people with autism who struggle with social cues.
That makes sense. It really highlights how much we rely on these unconscious processes to navigate like the social world around us. But, all this talk about how our brains work kind of makes me wonder about the role of our environment.
Yeah.
Like, do our surroundings influence how we think and act?
Yeah, it's not just what's going on inside our heads.
Mm-hmm.
It's also how the environment shapes our behavior.
Mm.
And he uses this idea of the adaptive toolbox,
Okay.
which is essentially this collection of rules of thumb that we develop based on the structure of the environment.
So it's nature and nurture. We're not just born with these things, but we adapt to our surroundings as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he uses some great analogies. So, for example, imagine an amp's path on a beach.
Okay.
It might seem random and complex, but it's actually being shaped by the hills and valleys in the sand.
So it's not like the ant is thinking through this elaborate path. It's just responding to its surroundings.
Exactly. Another good example is a rat in a maze.
Yeah, classic.
If a rat consistently turns left to find food, it's not necessarily doing complex calculations. It might just be that in that specific environment, turning left leads to food.
Right. Interesting. So we're seeing these simple rules of thumb combined with feedback from the environment, and that leads to behavior that seems a lot more complicated than it actually is.
Right. And this adaptive toolbox idea goes beyond physical environments. It also applies to the social structures we create.
Okay.
So he talks about how we actually use this concept to foster a culture of collaboration at the Max Planck Institute.
That's fascinating. How did he do that?
Well, he had noticed that researchers, like most people, tend to stick to their own groups and sometimes even look down on others.
Yeah.
So he intentionally designed an environment that encouraged interaction and collaboration. So things like a regular afternoon coffee break, shared workspaces, just to get people talking and working together.
It's amazing how those little things can have such a big impact on dynamics like that.
Yeah. And it really highlights how we need to consider both the mind and the environment if we want to understand behavior. It's a powerful reminder that we're shaped by our surroundings.
This kind of reminds me of that quote by Herbert Simon, where he says that understanding human behavior is like understanding how a pair of scissors cuts. You need to look at both blades, the mind and the environment, to get the full picture.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And speaking of the mind, let's dive into something that challenges the idea of like logical reasoning, the conjunction fallacy.
Okay.
So fallacy sounds intriguing. What is that?
It's a really interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
It shows how our intuition can sometimes clash with formal logic,
Okay.
even when we think we're being perfectly rational. So are you ready to have your mind bent a little further?
Absolutely. Hit me with it.
Okay, so here's the classic example. It's called the Linda problem. So imagine a woman named Linda. She's 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice and participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, which is more probable? Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement?
Well, based on her background, it seems way more likely that she's both a bank teller and a feminist.
And that's what most people think, but statistically speaking, it's actually more probable that she's simply a bank teller.
Wait, hold on. How is that possible?
Because adding the detail about being a feminist actually makes it less likely because we're narrowing down the possibilities.
So you're telling me my intuition is leading me astray here?
Yeah, it's because our brains often prioritize plausibility over strict logic in these kinds of situations. We create this mental image of Linda based on the description, and that image just fits better with the idea of her being a feminist bank teller.
So it's not that we're being like illogical, we're just using a different type of reasoning, one that's based more on our understanding of the world and how things usually work.
Exactly. And Gigerenzer's argument is that we shouldn't just judge these intuitions as irrational.
Okay.
We need to consider the context, the goals of our thinking, the inherent uncertainty of the real world.
I'm starting to see how all this connects. Our brains are constantly making these rapid-fire judgments, using rules of thumb, shortcuts, navigating this really complex and unpredictable world. But what about bigger decisions, like the kind where we have to actually weigh multiple options? Does intuition play a role there too?
It definitely does. And that leads us to this concept of one-reason decision-making,
Okay.
which challenges that classic model where we're supposed to carefully weigh all the pros and cons before making a choice.
So like Ben Franklin's balance sheet.
Yeah, exactly. But in reality, we often just make decisions based on a single dominant reason, ignoring other factors that might also be relevant.
Can I get a name and a...
And you know what? There's actually evidence to suggest that this approach can be quite effective. So think about marketing campaigns.
Okay.
They often focus on just one powerful reason to buy a product.
Like McDonald's, an easy way to feel like a good parent.
Exactly. They're tapping into a single powerful emotion.
Yeah.
And it obviously resonates with a lot of people. It's like they're bypassing all the complex decision-making by offering one compelling reason to choose their product.
So they're basically saying, don't overthink it, just go with this one good reason. Interesting. But does this apply beyond marketing? Are there other examples of this one good reason principle at work?
Yeah, so we're seeing it in marketing, but is this one good reason thing actually working in the real world? Give me some examples.
Absolutely. The political arena is a great example. Ever wonder how people who aren't really that into politics still manage to have like consistent voting preferences?
Yeah.
They might be using something called the string heuristic.
Okay, another heuristic. All right. I'm intrigued. Tell me about this one. So picture like a political spectrum, ranging from left to right. And the string heuristic essentially says the closer a party's views are to your own position on that spectrum, the more likely you are to vote for them.
So instead of like reading through each party's platform and like going through every single issue, they just kind of use that left-right spectrum as a quick guide.
Exactly.
That's pretty interesting.
And it can be really effective, especially in political systems where parties actually align themselves along that clear spectrum.
Right. It's kind of like a shortcut for making sense of the political world.
Exactly.
All right, but does this go beyond voting? Is this one good reason thing happening in other areas of life as well?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So there's a study in the book that looked at how parents choose primary care doctors for their kids.
Okay.
And it's turned out that almost half of them made their decision based on one main factor, whether the doctor really listened to them.
So even with things like wait times or location, that doctor listens factor was
Hmm.
like the deciding factor for them.
It became that one good reason.
Huh.
And there's another really fascinating example from the world of sports. So researchers looked at how well they could predict the outcome of NBA games.
Okay.
And they compared a really simple heuristic called take the best with a much more complex statistical model, even Bayes' rule.
Okay, take the best. That sounds almost too simple to work. What's the logic there?
Well, it boils down to focusing on one key piece of information. Which team has the better track record? If that's a tie, you look at which team is in the lead at halftime, and that's it.
And that held up against these complex statistical models.
In that study, yes. It really highlights that sometimes zeroing in on the most predictive piece of information can be just as accurate or even more accurate than trying to take everything into account.
It's almost like we're wired for efficiency, finding those shortcuts to make sense of everything. But let's get back to healthcare for a minute. You said earlier that blindly trusting doctors isn't always the best approach. So how can this less is more thinking lead to better decisions when it comes to medicine?
Well, it's all about finding that balance, right, between overthinking things and just going on blind faith. And Gigerenzer talks about something called fast and frugal trees as a really useful tool for doctors.
Fast and frugal trees. Okay, that doesn't sound very medical.
Think of them as like streamlined decision-making tools.
Hmm.
So instead of relying on those really complex models, these trees use a few key questions to reach a diagnosis or figure out the best treatment.
So it's kind of like a simplified flowchart that helps them make quicker, more accurate decisions.
Exactly. So there was a case study in Michigan where doctors were sending pretty much anyone with chest pains to the ICU,
Oh, wow.
and it was leading to overcrowding and potentially even putting some patients at risk.
Yeah, it's that better safe than sorry approach, but not necessarily the most efficient.
Right. But then they started using a fast and frugal tree that was based on just a few key questions, and it significantly improved both their accuracy and the quality of patient care. It's all about finding that right balance.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. Heuristics, the benefits of forgetting, one reason decision making. But there's one more area I want to touch on: moral behavior. Can intuition actually play a role in our ethical choices?
That's a really interesting question. And, Gigerenzer argues that, yes, our moral behavior is often guided by these unconscious rules of thumb as well. And understanding those rules can help us make like better, more ethical choices.
Okay, so this is where things get a little bit heavier. How do these rules of thumb actually shape our moral compass?
Well, let's think about the Reserve Police Battalion 101 and those horrific acts that happened during the Holocaust. And the book suggests that many of those men weren't driven by like pure hatred, but by a very different social rule: don't break ranks.
So their loyalty to their comrades kind of overrode their moral obligation to not harm innocent people.
It really shows how powerful these unconscious rules can be, even in the face of truly awful acts. And he talks about how our moral intuitions are rooted in three things: a lack of conscious awareness, a set of basic rules of thumb, and the influence of our social environment.
So it's this mix of like innate instincts and learned rules and what the people around us are doing.
Exactly.
This deep dive has really changed the way I think about intuition. It's not just these like random gut feelings. It's this complex and often intelligent system that's shaped by evolution and our own experiences.
It's about recognizing that intuition has its own logic,
Hmm.
one that's often faster, more efficient, and surprisingly accurate in certain situations.
Should we all just like ditch logic and embrace our gut all the time?
Not necessarily. It's
Mhm.
about understanding both the power and the limits of intuition. Yeah. Sometimes a simple rule of thumb is all you need. Other times you need careful deliberation. It's about knowing when to trust your gut and when to engage in that more analytical thinking.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. It's really given me a new appreciation for the power of intuition.
And remember, there's always more to learn. If you're interested in exploring this further, I highly recommend checking out Gerd Gigerenzer's book, Gut Feelings.
Until next time, fellow deep divers, keep questioning, keep learning, and yeah, maybe trust your gut a little more.